So a recession is coming. We don't know when, we don't know the extent of it, but we know absolutely and most definitely a recession is coming. Maybe it could be next month, maybe it could be next year, maybe it could be 5 years from now. We really don't know when the next recession is going to hit, but we know absolutely and most definitely it will hit. Okay, so let's talk about 3 or 4, maybe 5 different possibilities that could significantly affect the next recession, really throw us into this recession, and how you can sort of predict them and see them coming. But like I said, though, it's not easy to predict a recession. Even the biggest brains in the world can't figure out when a recession is exactly going to occur and the extent of it. So let's talk about these different factors that could affect it. I think one thing to keep in mind here is that people say, oh my God, we've been in a bull market for 9 years. We haven't had a recession in almost a decade. We're definitely going to have one this year. That's what a lot of people have been saying, but there's a pretty common saying that bulls don't die of old age. They usually get shot in the head by the central bank. And this is really true. Like, you're not going to just have a bull market die just because it's time. There's going to be something that stems that, and a lot of times it is the Fed that ends up making that happen. But okay, so let's talk about these different possibilities. I think the biggest reason why we end up in recessions, this is the number one reason why we end up in most recessions, is due to complacency. It's due to complacency and overconfidence within the markets, and that's talking about the consumers' overconfidence, that's talking about the big banks, that's talking about the central banks, that's talking about the Fed, overconfidence and complacency. So sort of the way that I see it is like, say you have this pier, like a big wooden fishing pier, you know, you see those at the beach or something, right? And you see all these different pillars, and they're all standing there, and they're holding up this pier. And one of them could be broken. One could be about to fall over. Maybe it's rotting. Maybe you don't see it. But there's one of them that it's not easy to pick out which one, but there's one of them that maybe might be weak, might fall over. And if one pillar falls over, the whole pier could possibly go down, come crashing down. So that's sort of how I view it, because it's so difficult to actually find like this one pillar out of like 300 pillars. How are you going to find the one that's weak and that's going to fall? And that's kind of what happens here. If we look back into the past, we can look at some of the other recessions, like the housing market collapse in 2007. Very difficult to see that. There's so many factors that go into it. How are we going to know that it's that's going to cause that? Or you look at the dot-com bubble, you know, all these companies that were overvalued, but we didn't really realize it. And I want to say that we were complacent in a sense, where we didn't see it until it was too late, because if we knew it was coming, we wouldn't be in nearly as bad of a recession, because we would have been able to prepare for it a lot better. But one day you wake up and say, oh my God, this is way overvalued. We have a serious problem. There's no coming back from this. We're going to hit down into a recession. So that's kind of what can happen here. Complacency and overconfidence within the markets. And all it takes is really one factor that can significantly affect the economy and drag the whole thing down. It's sort of like a domino effect, you know. It's like that one pillar on the pier. If that falls, and then all of a sudden the whole pier starts to go down. That kind of is what happens with recessions. So let's talk about some different possibilities. Let's get more detailed here, other than just overconfidence and complacency, which might be a little bit more obvious. So one thing that could affect recessions is interest rates and inflation. So this one might be a little bit more boring, usually stems more boring recessions. But so the way that this works is that the Fed, which is in control of monetary policy, what they can do is they can control the interest rate. So what they do, their job is really to kind of smooth out the economy. So they don't want big ups and downs, like, you know, the roaring 20s, it's great, and then Great Depression. Not fun. Their whole goal is to make everything nice and smooth, so that our growth is like this, you know, very, very linear growth within the economy, which is better for economic growth in the long run, because if you can predict the economy in the future, you're gonna have better growth. That's just the way that it works. So the Fed, what they try to do, they try to smooth everything out, and so what they can do is they can raise and lower the base interest rate, and this can really affect the economy in various ways. So essentially what the Fed does is, as the economy is going up, they'll, generally speaking, they'll raise the interest rate along with the economy going up and up and up, and they're raising the interest rate along the way. So I believe that the interest rate right now is like 1.75%. But from 2009 until 2015, or maybe 2008 from 2015, they did not touch the interest rate. It was at 0.25%, which is essentially 0% interest rate for 7 years. And that's because they wanted to have this expansionary policy where it was very easy to borrow money so that the economy would grow faster, because we were in a recession for a pretty long time, pretty bad recession back in 2008, 2009. So this is kind of how it works. But what can happen, though, is that the Fed can raise interest rates too quickly. And what this will do is it'll squeeze companies, and it'll sort of discourage people from actually investing, businesses and people individually from investing, because the interest rate could rise too quickly, and then that could sort of throw us back into a recession in a sense. So this is why the Fed didn't raise interest rates for 7 years, from 2008 to 2015. They didn't raise interest rates for that long, because if they had raised them, say that they tried to raise the interest rate from 0 to 2% in like 2012 or 2013, what would probably have happened is we would just get thrown right back into the recession. So that's kind of a concern that people have. And the way that I think of it is like the Fed's sort of like tiptoeing through like broken glass, and they're in bare feet, and they're like trying to step perfectly, like walking through hot coals, and they're trying to step perfectly through this, and they can really mess it up pretty easily, because it's only a handful of people. Now, they might be geniuses, but it's still only a handful of people who are making these decisions that can significantly affect our economy. And that's why that saying goes about the Fed shooting the bull in the head, because it can happen pretty easily. And so you want to know who's on the Fed board. And I think, generally speaking, I think it's pretty predictable. The chairman at the moment is pretty predictable. We know what he's going to do, but it's always going to be something that you want to keep in mind of how the Fed's actually going to act, because they can significantly affect the economy, and that's probably the biggest cause for recessions. They have a lot of their hands in the mix, and they can definitely change recessions and make them happen at different times and whatnot. So they have a lot of control over the economy. They use various tools, quantitative easing. They have about $4 trillion on their books right now from quantitative easing from the last recession. That's a whole nother video in itself, though. We're going to talk about quantitative easing maybe next week or something, if I remember to make that video. So let's talk about some other different factors that could affect the next recession, sort of cause the next recession, or at least amplify the effects of the next recession. And I think the next one might not be the #1 primary cause of a recession, but it would certainly amplify it, and that is the student loan crisis. Now, I would certainly call it a student loan crisis at the point. It's at $1.5 trillion in student loan debt just in the United States. That's $1.5 trillion. That's more than credit card debt. And I think it's only behind mortgages, home mortgages, and there's a big difference there between these two types of debt. Home mortgages, they have houses backing that. Like, they have physical properties that the banks can repossess. A student loan, what's backing a student loan? Like, you got knowledge in your brain. They can't take that out unless they did some lobotomy or something, but you really can't do that. And so that's the issue with student loans. And when you see, kids, 17, 18-year-old kids, taking out $250,000 loans, quite literally $250,000 loans. I'm not making that up. Look up the cost of college. Some colleges are charging $70,000, $80,000 per year to go to their university. So when kids are taking out $250,000 loans to get a degree that, I don't want to say it's useless, but some degrees, you might get out and be lucky to make $30,000 a year with it, or $40,000 a year with it. And there's a lot of degrees out there that kids are going to college for that aren't necessarily high-paying jobs. And so they take out a $250,000 loan. You don't have to be a mathematician to figure that out. $250,000 loan, $30,000 a year income, or $40,000 a year income off of that. Even if you're just becoming like a teacher or something, I think the average teacher's salary is somewhere like $40,000 or $50,000 per year, and you're taking out a massive loan for that. Have fun paying that off. That's going to be a serious problem, and I think it's going to significantly amplify the next recession. Maybe not the next one, maybe the one after that, but definitely it's going to affect some recession in the future, because people are going to start defaulting on those loans. It's not easy to get forgiven for your student loans either. It's very difficult. Even if you file for Chapter 11, likely what could happen, and I'm not a lawyer here, but likely what could happen is you would have to end up making these sort of payments. Every time you get a paycheck, they'll take a percentage of your paycheck out, maybe like 5 or 10% for the next 10, 20, 30 years, depending on how much money you owe. You can look into that, but it's generally not easy to get forgiven for student loans. So that's definitely a possibility. It's one that's really scaring me. $1.5 trillion, that's a lot of money that kids are taking on to go to college. And it's concern. I think we have issues within our education system. I don't want to get political here. I'm not saying that we need free college, okay? But I think we have a lot of issues within our education system, and I think it's going to haunt us in the future. I think it's flawed. I think there's issues within it. I'm not saying that we need free education, but I think that we have a lot of issues, and we need to figure that out very soon. So let's talk about some different possibilities here. Another possibility that is probably more obvious that comes to mind when you think about what could cause a recession, and that's something like a political catalyst. So we can go back into the past. We can think about different political catalysts. This could be trade wars, like the one that we just had a scare with a few weeks ago with Trump and the Chinese president. That could significantly negatively affect the economy if we entered into this serious trade protectionism, as we saw, like what happened with the Smoot-Hawley Act in the early 1930s. That definitely amplified the Great Depression, because if we create this trade protectionism and we don't let anybody trade with us and we're like just focused on our own country, that could create a lot of problems, and economic growth as a whole throughout the world would most likely be slower, because generally speaking, trade is always going to be beneficial. So trade wars, any other type of political catalyst, like an actual physical war, if Kim Jong nukes Hawaii, if he nukes Guam, that's going to be a problem. For example, if you look at the September 11th attacks in 2001, that didn't really affect the economy in a great way for the U.S. That sort of was another factor that sort of ended up in that recession in the early 2000s, right after the dot-com bubble, but it was sort of entwined with that. It didn't help when you have terrorists flying planes into some of the biggest buildings in the world. Not good for the economy, because it creates this sort of unpredictability where you don't know what's going to happen next. You don't know, are we going to be in a war next month? Are we going to get attacked again? So there's a lot of issues within that. And the economy, it likes to know what's coming. You like to know what's coming with the economy, and when you don't know what's coming, it's going to be a lot more turbulent. And so political catalysts, definitely a possibility. We can also look into the past. We can say something like the 1973 oil crisis. Now, that's not something that you can really blame on complacency, because this isn't something you can really predict easily. So the first point that I made was that complacency is a huge factor into this, but political catalysts can kind of be sort of that exception to it, because you can't really predict the oil crisis and the response to the Yom Kippur War. I think that's what it was for. But OPEC essentially said, nah, screw you, America. We're not giving you oil. Now all of a sudden, oil prices jack up 400% per barrel, and we enter this supply shock, which creates stagflation. Not good for the economy. Definitely a factor that negatively affected the economy and sort of ended up in that recession in the early 70s that we saw. So that's definitely a possibility. Could happen in the future. There's a lot of different things that could go up in the air that could happen. Generally speaking, we're in a pretty peaceful time. There's not many wars going on in the world right now, and I don't want to say that we're completely peaceful. There's a lot of small proxy wars going on between smaller countries, but generally speaking, we're pretty peaceful at the moment in terms of number of deaths and whatnot within the world. So that's something you want to think about. Political catalysts, not really something you can predict, so it's kind of one really out of your control. Like, you can't see it coming. Like if you ever saw the movie The Big Short, great movie. I don't really watch movies, but it's one of those movies that I really would suggest that you watch. It's about kind of how the Great Recession started back in 2007, 2008, 2009, how it really came about, and one of those big things was due to the collapse of the housing market. And so that movie, there was like a select few of people who actually really saw it coming and took out short positions on some of these different loans and whatnot. And so what they did with this, that's definitely a possibility, but you can't really predict some type of political catalyst. You can't be like, oh, 2 months from now, this is going to happen, and South Korea is going to do this, and China is going to do this. You can't really predict that. So it's not something really in your control. So I wouldn't suggest worrying about political catalysts too much. Obviously, just keep up with the news a little bit. You want to know what's going on, think about future possibilities. But generally speaking, I wouldn't worry about it too much. Now let's talk about another factor that I hear a lot of people talking about, and I want to address this one because it's very interesting. So the factor that I hear a lot of people talking about is this Amazon effect, and they're scared about the possible upcoming recession due to the Amazon effect. And essentially what they're scared of here is that millions, tens of millions of Americans are employed by retail companies. So Walmart, for example, employs 1.5 million people just in the United States. So think about, other companies, that's just Walmart, 1.5 million people. Think about JCPenney, Macy's, Target, Kohl's, so many companies. There's tens of millions of people who work for these companies in retail, in stores. And what people are concerned about is if Amazon and other online retailers take over this business too quickly, we could see unemployment spike pretty significantly. Now, I think this is sort of over-exaggerated, and I'll give you the reason here, because since the 1930s, there's always been this concern that robots are taking over the world. That's been a legitimate concern for the past 80-some years now, that people think that robots are going to take over the world, and maybe they are, and that's a whole discussion in itself later on down the road. What are people going to do? when we have automation and computers doing everything. I don't know, but I think it's a little bit over exaggerated. You look at the unemployment rate right now, 4.1%, and then you look at how many retail jobs were lost from 2001 until now, millions have been lost, and we still have a 4.1% unemployment rate. So I think we'll be okay. I think only the big issue that we could have, like the way that this could actually formulate and really snowball into a recession, is if it happened too quickly. So if something like all these stores had to start shutting down even more of their locations very, very rapidly. And I know they are shutting down their locations, like JCPenney, Macy's. A lot of these stores are shutting down their locations. I don't even think Walmart really opened up many locations last year. They might have even closed more than they opened. Don't quote me on that one though, but I think they actually have. And so I think this is a little bit overplayed because I believe it's going to sort of fizzle out. So retail is going to fizzle out and online retail is going to pick up. And that's been happening for the past 10, 15 years. But I think that's just the way it's going to work. And it's not going to be something instantly where it's like 10 million people, 20 million people lose their jobs, all of the Walmarts close down. I think it's going to fizzle out. It's kind of like, VHS tapes and CDs. Like the transition there, it wasn't just like one day everybody stops using VHS tapes and they all go to CDs. No, it's like sort of slowly over time, people trickle out of VHS and CDs go up and more people use those. So I think that's kind of how it's going to work. So I wouldn't worry about the unemployment rate in regards to online retail. I'm sure there's going to be some other thing that people can find to do because you do know that like Amazon does really use a lot of automation. They have robots that go back and forth that like find packages and stuff. Really crazy what they do. You can watch some weird YouTube videos on like the actually scary stuff that Amazon does with these robots. So there's just a few possibilities that could sort of amplify or stem recessions. Now, maybe I'll make a part 2 to this video because like there's literally dozens of other possibilities that I didn't even touch on in this video that could certainly influence the next recession. I think I only mentioned like 3 or 4 different possibilities here. There's so many possibilities, but for the sake of this video, I don't want to make it like 5 hours long. Let's just kind of cut this video off now, and then if you're subscribed, I'll make some more videos in the future about recessions and some other factors that could definitely affect those recessions in the future. So that kind of wraps up this video. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. I'd love to have a great discussion with you about the economy. I love economics, so leave it down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time.